Sahara is often pictured as a simple sea of sand, yet it sprawls across roughly 9 million square kilometers, a hot desert larger than many people's entire idea of a continent. But the real shock is this much of Sahara isn't sand at all. It is stone plateaus, gravel, plains, salt pans, and wind-carved mountains, a giant engine that can lift dust into the sky and send it across oceans. In a place where rain can vanish for months, what keeps anything alive? And if the desert is still moving grain by grain, gust by gust, what does permanent even mean? Sahara looks empty from high above, but its emptiness is built like a layered archive. The desert sits across an ancient core of Africa, old rocks that have endured for hundreds of millions of years, while wind heat and rare violence from water keep rewriting the surface. That is why Sahara never holds one face for long. It shifts between ergs, sand seas regs, gravel plains, hamadas, stone plateaus and sabkas, salt flats, as if the land itself is changing costumes. The first surprise is scale and shape. Vast sand seas exist, yes, but they are only one chapter. In places like the Grand Erg Oriental on the edge of Algeria and Tunisia, dunes roll like frozen waves, crescent-shaped barshans, marching downwind ridges, braided like corded rope slopes, steep enough to sing under the right conditions when sand grains slide in unison. Yet travel a few hours away, and the sand thins into a hard, stony crust, where the horizon becomes sharper and harsher. This is Hamada country flat rock, broken by ribs of darker stone, where tires bite heat, shimmers, and nothing feels soft. Sahara's mountains are the next clue that this desert is not a simple flatland. The Ahagar in southern Algeria rises like a blackened spine, volcanic remnants, and resistant rocks standing above the plains. Farther east, the Tibesti Mountains in Chad punch, higher still an island of altitude in a sea of aridity. These ranges do more than decorate the skyline. They bend winds, steer storms, and create pockets where cooler nights, occasional rainfall, or hidden springs must allow life to cling on. In a land where a single dependable water source can shape a settlement, a route and a history, mountains become more than geology, they become destiny. Then there is water, the element Sahara seems to forbid, yet the one that leaves some of its most dramatic scars. When rain finally arrives, it often comes as brief, intense bursts. Dry channels called wadis can become violent rivers in minutes, tearing through loose sediment, carving gullies and spreading fans of gravel across the plains. These floods vanish quickly, but they deliver a message: the desert is not only made by dryness, it is also made by rare moments of force. Even more telling are the ghost structures, ancient shorelines, lake beds, and river traces, hints of a Sahara that once looked nothing like this. During the African humid period thousands of years ago, parts of today's desert held lakes, grasslands, and wildlife corridors. When climate patterns shifted and monsoon rains retreated, the green world contracted, water bodies shrank, and sand and stone reclaimed what had been temporarily soft and living. Wind, however, is Sahara's most constant sculptor. Heat drives daily pressure changes. Air moves. The surface responds. Over time, wind sorts particles by weight and shape, lifting fine dust into the sky and leaving heavier gravel. Behind one reason, Rej and Hamada, landscapes can dominate so much of the desert. In certain corridors, wind accelerates like water through a narrowing canyon. One of the most infamous examples is the Baudelaire Depression in Chad, a low-lying basin where strong winds can funnel and whip the surface into massive dust plumes. From space, these plumes can look like pale storms that are not made of clouds at all, but of Earth itself minerals and microscopic fragments of ancient lake beds rising and traveling far beyond the desert's borders. Sahara, in other words, does not stay in Sahara. It exports pieces of it. Even the sand seas are not stable monuments. Dunes migrate. Their crests shift season by season, year by year, shaped by prevailing windstorms and the subtle trap of vegetation near the desert's margins. Some dunes can move meters in a year, swallowing old tracks, revealing new patterns, erasing yesterday's certainty. This is why maps in the Sahara have always been more than paper. Routes are remembered by stars, by landmarks of rock, by the taste of a well, by the timing of a wind. And beneath all of it is the quiet truth that Sahara is not merely a desert. It is a system. Ancient bedrock sets the stage. Mountains interrupt the emptiness. Rare rain acts like a sudden chisel. Wind operates like a relentless brush. Together they create a landscape that looks timeless, while changing constantly, slowly and visibly, and then all at once. If the ground can shift without warning, if dunes can travel like living things, and if a storm can turn a dry channel into a roaring river for a single night, then in a place like this, what does it even mean to call the land? At first glance, Sahara seems to reject the very idea of life. The air is too dry, the sun too direct, the distances too enormous. But the desert does not eliminate life, it selects it. Everything that survives here does so by becoming a specialist in timing, in temperature, in water, in invisibility. Sahara is not a place where creatures simply live. It is a place where they negotiate every hour. The first rule is to avoid the sun. Many animals become nocturnal not out of preference, but necessity. When the day burns, the desert belongs to heat and wind. When night arrives and temperatures drop, movement becomes possible. In the cool darkness, small tracks appear in the sand, like whispered handwriting, the quick dotted steps of rodents, the clean light imprint of a fox, the dragging signature of a lizard's tail. It is a secret economy life, spending its energy when the world is less expensive. One emblem of that secret economy is the fennec fox. With oversized ears and a compact body, it looks almost designed by the desert itself. Those ears help shed heat, while its lifestyle, night hunting, daytime sheltering, reduces water loss. It can survive with minimal drinking, pulling moisture from prey and food. But the fennec is only one note in a larger chorus of adaptations. Reptiles that bask just enough to move, but not enough to overheat insects, that burrow and wait birds, that travel immense distances between water sources. Then there are animals built for distance. The Sahara's most famous traveler is the dromedary camel, often called the desert ship. Yet the camel is not simply tough. It is a carefully engineered compromise, broad feet to walk on sand nostrils that can close against dust, a body that can tolerate dehydration levels that would be fatal to many mammals, and a behavior pattern tuned to the desert's rhythm. Camels can go long periods without water and then drink astonishing amounts when they find it. But even camels depend on what the desert provides in small, scattered doses. Dry grasses after a rare rain, thorny shrubs, Not all survival is movement. Some survival is patience. On the edges of Sahara, where desert meets Sahel and steppe plant life plays the long game, many species remain dormant as seeds through brutal dry seasons, then explode into bloom after a brief rainfall painting normally colorless ground with sudden purples and yellows. This pulse ecology is one of the desert's great illusions. For most of the year, it appears lifeless. Then almost overnight, it looks reborn. Yet the rebirth is temporary and the window is narrow. If the rain comes too early, too late, or not at all, the cycle collapses. The desert's real forests are not trees. They are oases. And each oasis is a micro-world where biology clusters around the most valuable currency on Earth, water. An oasis can be a spring, a shallow aquifer, a water table close enough to reach, or a carefully protected well. The effect is dramatic. Where the surrounding land is pale and hard, the oasis becomes layered green. In many Saharan oases, date palms form the upper canopy, tall, resilient, and able to tolerate heat. Beneath them, farmers cultivate a second layer of fruit trees, and below that, a third layer of vegetables. This structure is not only agriculture, it is climate engineering. On a human scale, shade reduces evaporation. Layers protect soil. The oasis becomes a manufactured ecosystem that can last for generations until water is depleted. These living islands are not rare curiosities. They are the most important ecological junctions in the desert, allowing both wildlife and people to move across what would otherwise be impassable emptiness. Around them you can find birds that stop mid-migration, insects that thrive in pockets of humidity, reptiles that hunt near vegetation, and mammals that time their journeys with knowledge older than written maps. One oasis is never just one oasis. It is a node in a network, one that determines routes, stories, and survival. Beyond oases, Sahara's biodiversity hides in landscapes that seem too harsh to host anything. Consider the salt flats and chats, low basins where water appears seasonally and then evaporates, leaving behind crusted white surfaces that glare under sunlight. Life here is sparse, but not absent. Certain microorganisms can tolerate extreme salinity. Some plants can survive on the margins adapted to salt stress. After rare flooding, these flats can become temporary wetlands, brief mirrors that reflect sky and vanish again. The desert is full of such brief miracles, not permanent enough to build confidence, but real enough to sustain chains of. The mountains change the rules once more. In the Ahagar and Tibesti altitude brings colder nights, more condensation, and a slightly higher chance of rainfall. Valleys can trap moisture. Shaded slopes can preserve it longer. Plants that would not survive on open plains can exist in protected pockets. Small mammals, birds of prey, and specialized reptiles can find niches in rock crevices and canyon shadows. These uplands are like ecological refuges, places where life can retreat during harsh phases and expand again when conditions allow. Yet the Sahara's ecology is not only about what lives there, it is also about what the desert sends outward. When winds lift dust from the ground, they carry minerals and nutrients far beyond North Africa. This dust can fertilize distant oceans and forests, connecting Sahara to ecosystems that appear unrelated. A desert, in that sense, becomes an exporter of particles of chemistry of influence. It is a reminder that barren does not mean isolated. Even when it looks empty, Sahara participates in global systems, climate, atmosphere, nutrient cycles, like a hidden engine running in the background of the planet. But this engine is sensitive. Sahara's life depends on small margins. the timing of rain pulses, the stability of water tables under oases, the health of transitional zones at the desert's edge. When those margins shift through long-term climate change, overuse of groundwater, or the slow spread of aridity species do not just relocate. Many have nowhere to go. The desert expands, not like an army, but like a tide, quietly, consistently, and then suddenly a familiar boundary has moved. So the Sahara is alive, but alive in a different way than a forest or a river valley. Here, biodiversity is not about abundance. It is about strategy. It is about shadows, burrows, timing, and the discipline of wasting nothing. And that leads to the next question, the one that pulls the camera away from footprints and towards stories. If animals have evolved to read Sahara's harsh rules, how did humans do it? What kind of culture forms when your most trusted companion is not a road but a wind? And your most dangerous enemy is not a predator but thirst. Long before Sahara became a synonym for empty, it was a corridor, sometimes even a homeland. The desert's oldest human story is not written in cities, but in shifts of climate, and the thin, stubborn traces people left behind when the land was kinder. During wetter millennia, when monsoon patterns reached farther north, parts of the Sahara held lakes, grasslands, and seasonal rivers. This phase is often described as a Green Sahara, but the more haunting truth is what that phrase implies. The desert's current face is not its only identity. Sahara has worn other skins. The evidence lies in places where rock becomes a library. In the sandstone plateau of Tassili, Niger, in southeastern Algeria, cliffs and sheltered overhangs preserve thousands of rock images. Animals with rounded bodies, herds in motion, human figures and ritual postures, scenes that suggest a world with water and grazing land. These are not casual doodles. They are clues about how people understood the land, what they hunted, what they feared, what they celebrated, and what they believed was sacred enough to carve into stone. When modern eyes look at those figures, cattle where no pasture exists today, they are forced to confront a simple question. If the desert can change this completely, what else can change without warning? As the Sahara dried again, people did not vanish. They adapted, and adaptation became culture. Survival in a tightening world demanded new skills, reading the sky, memorizing water sources, understanding seasons that were no longer reliable. Over time, communities learned that the desert was not one uniform enemy. It was a mosaic of zones, rock plateaus that were harsh, but navigable sand seas that could erase direction, mountain uplands that offered refuge, and oases that could become both sanctuary and trap. Oases were the earliest magnets. Wherever groundwater approached the surface, their world was not built on the generosity of rainfall, but on engineering and persistence. Underground channels, often described as Foggara-like systems, helped feed settlements and gardens in a landscape that otherwise offered little mercy. With water, they could grow crops, sustain caravans, and turn a desert crossroads into a lasting society. In a place where a well can decide whether a family lives or dies, water management is not agriculture. It is power. It is politics. It is the foundation of culture. As the Sahara hardened, mobility became the most important technology. People who remained learned to travel with the desert rather than against it. Across northern Africa, desert societies evolved around movement, seasonal, purposeful, and deeply informed by knowledge passed through generations. Among the most iconic are the Tuareg, often recognized by indigo-dyed cloth, and a tradition of navigating immense distances through open land. But navigation here did not mean roads. It meant reading subtleties, the direction of a wind that shifts at dusk, the angle of stars across different seasons, the shape of a distant. Other desert communities developed parallel forms of resilience. Groups such as the Tubu in the central Sahara's harsher corridors are often associated with endurance in some of the most arid terrains on Earth, where settlements can be separated by distances that feel almost unreasonable. The point is not to reduce people to stereotypes of toughness, but to recognize that the desert shaped social systems, cooperation, and caution hospitality, and boundaries trade and secrecy. When culture in the Sahara also formed around what could be carried. If forests produce architecture and rivers produce boats, the desert produces portable life tents, textiles, tools, songs, and stories designed to move. Oral tradition becomes a survival mechanism. A song can teach a route. A proverb can warn about a season. A legend can encode a landmark. And when night falls, when the heat drains away and the sky opens like a black ocean, storytelling becomes more than entertainment. It becomes instruction, inheritance, and identity. Religion and ritual were shaped by the same forces. In landscapes where storms can arrive without warning and drought can last longer than a childhood, people naturally build meaning around uncertainty. Rock art suggests ceremonies, dances masked figures, moments when communities tried to negotiate with the invisible. Later traditions across the Saharan world often placed enormous respect on the element's wind that can blind heat, that can kill water, that can resurrect. The desert does not just test bodies, it tests belief systems, forcing them to answer questions about fate, endurance, and community. Then there's the desert's most delicate relationship, the the one between people and animals. Long before camels dominated popular imagination, humans in the Sahara relied on what the environment could support. In greener phases, cattle and herding cultures likely played major roles. As aridity intensified, the logic of pastoral life changed. Herds had to move farther, grazing windows shrank, water points became critical. Over centuries, desert herding became less about owning animals and more about understanding time, when to leave, when to return, when the land could give and when it would punish. But perhaps the most powerful early lesson Sahara taught humans was this: nothing survives alone. Even the most independent traveler depends on a chain of knowledge, someone who knows the next well, someone who understands the wind, someone who can read the sky when the horizon offers no clues. That dependence created a culture of codes, hospitality rules, that could mean the difference between life and death, trading relationships that turned strangers into allies, warnings about places where the land lies. In many desert traditions, the desert also taught humans to treat resources as sacred. In wetter climates, abundance can hide waste. In Sahara, waste becomes a visible sin. Water storage, food preservation, repair of tools, reuse of materials, these are not quaint old ways. They are the logic of survival. Even celebration adapts. Tea traditions, shared meals, music under open skies, these become moments of warmth in a place that often feels emotionally cold. The Sahara does not erase joy, but it forces joy to be intentional. Archaeology adds another layer of humility. Sahara has been a stage for many human chapters, not a single story. Stone tools, burial sites, rock engravings, and scattered remains across different zones suggest waves of settlement and movement influenced by climate pulses and opportunities. Human presence in the Sahara expands when conditions soften and contracts when drought returns like breathing. The desert teaches that history is not a straight line. And yet the Sahara is not only a teacher, it is also a transformer. Because once people learn to cross it, the desert stops being a barrier and becomes a bridge. Oases become meeting points. Roots become traditions. Skills become reputations. The earliest desert. That transformation sets up the next era, when movement becomes organized into long-distance routes, when water points become economic power, and when the Sahara begins to connect empires through trade, exploration, and conquest. So the question shifts quietly but completely. There is a moment in Sahara's history when the desert stops being a blank on the edge of maps and becomes something far more dangerous and far more valuable, a corridor. Not a corridor of roads and bridges, but of agreements, risks, and repeating knowledge. Once people learned how to cross the desert with consistency, the Sahara began to function like an ancient global network. It moved goods, yes, but it also moved faith, language, technology, and power. The engine of this network was the trans-Saharan trade, a long-distance system that linked the Mediterranean world with the Sahel and West Africa. From the north came textiles, metal goods, and manufactured items. From the south came commodities that changed the course of economies, gold, ivory, and later tragically human beings caught in slavery systems. But in the Sahara itself, the most essential trade item was neither gold nor cloth. It was salt, white, heavy, and life-sustaining. In hot climates, salt is a medicine. It preserves food. It keeps bodies working. Entire routes formed around it because salt could be mined in the desert and exchanged for gold and other goods farther south. One of the starkest images of this economy comes from salt extraction zones, such as Taoudeni in northern Mali, an environment so harsh it feels almost unreal. Workers cut rectangular slabs of salt from the ground, stack them like bricks, and prepare them for transport across distances that can stretch imagination. The desert turns even salt into a product of endurance. Then come the caravan's long lines of camels, each carrying a precise load, moving through the heat like a slow, determined tide. These were not romantic adventures. They were logistical operations. The Sahara's trade routes also produced cities, not in the modern sense of skyscrapers and density, but in the sense of strategic nodes. Towns grew where routes converged, where water could be accessed, where protection could be offered, where goods could be taxed, stored, and redistributed. Places on the northern edge of the Sahara, such as Sijil Massa in Morocco's historical trade geography, served as launching points into the desert, while Sahelian centers farther south became markets, scholarly hubs, and political capitals. The Sahara did not simply connect cities, it created the conditions that made trade never travels alone. It brings outsiders. It brings new languages and ideas. Over centuries, the movement across Sahara helped spread Islam into parts of West Africa, not merely through conquest, but through commerce, scholarship, and social ties. Merchants did not just deliver salt and cloth. They delivered books, legal traditions, and intellectual networks. In many cases, the desert's nodes became places where faith and knowledge were exchanged as naturally as goods. The Sahara, often imagined as empty, but the desert is not a neutral highway. Every crossing creates a hierarchy of risk. Those who know the desert hold an invisible advantage. Guides, caravan leaders, and communities who controlled wells could influence routes, demand payments, enforce rules, or deny access. A water point could become a political instrument. A rumor about a dried well could reroute trade and ruin profits. Even the wind could become part of power because it decides what is visible and what is hidden. This is where the Sahara's historical development becomes sharply human. The desert forced cooperation caravans, needed protection alliances, negotiation, but it also encouraged exploitation. Taxation and toll systems grew along routes. conflicts rose over access to water and territory. The same network that carried scholarship and prosperity could also carry violence. When resources are scarce and distances are unforgiving, domination can feel like efficiency. As centuries passed, new forces entered the Saharan stage: European explorers, colonial administrations, and modern borders, drawn with straight lines that often ignored the desert's older logic. For outsiders, Sahara was a challenge to be solved, a space to map, control, extract, and connect to coastal interests. Expeditions pushed inward, chasing knowledge, prestige, and economic opportunity. Yet the desert had always been mapped, just not in the way outsiders preferred. Its maps were embedded in oral knowledge star routes and community memory. When colonial mapping arrived, it did not replace emptiness. Colonial borders in North and West Africa often sliced across traditional movement zones. For desert communities whose lives depended on seasonal mobility, following grazing trade cycles, or family networks, these borders introduced friction. Movement that once required negotiation with nature now required negotiation with state power, permits restrictions, checkpoints, new legal definitions of belonging. In that sense, the Sahara's modern history contains a quieter kind of violence, the shrinking of movement. A nomadic world built on roots becomes pressed into fixed ideas. Meanwhile, economic development shifted. Coastal trade and modern infrastructure rerouted old flows. Some caravan networks declined. Certain towns lost influence. Others adapted. But the Sahara did not stop being strategic. In the modern era, it becomes tied to new resources and new anxieties: oil and gas extraction mining projects, strategic military corridors, migration routes, and smuggling networks that thrive in places where state control is thin. The desert's vastness still attracts those. Yet even in these heavy themes, Sahara's history also holds something luminous: the way it created interdependence between worlds. The Mediterranean North and the Sahelian South were not isolated destinies. They were linked by months-long journeys, by risky agreements, by shared marketplaces, and by the simple truth that one region had something the other needed. The desert did not prevent connection. It shaped the form of connection into something slow, costly, and therefore meaningful. This historical arc, trade routes turning into cultural bridges, then being interrupted by modern borders and economies, sets the stage for the Sahara of today. Because now the central question is no longer only how did people cross the desert, but how do people live with it under modern pressure? So the desert story moves into the present, and the tension becomes sharper. Can can the Sahara remain a living system, or will modern demands turn it into a resource to be consumed? And if the desert taught early cultures to waste nothing, what happens when the modern world arrives and wastes everything? Modern Sahara is not a museum. It is a living, stressed landscape, still ancient, still immense, but now caught between forces that move faster than dunes ever could. The desert's old rules remain. Water is destiny, distance is discipline, and heat punishes arrogance. Yet new pressures arrive from outside and within: climate volatility, groundwater extraction, mass tourism, resource development, and the reshaping of identities in a world that increasingly demands permanence from people whose survival once depended on mobility. Climate change does not simply mean hotter. In deserts, it often means more unstable extremes. Heat waves stretch longer. The timing of rain, already rare, can become less predictable. When rain does come, it may arrive in sudden, violent storms that trigger flash floods ripping through wadis and scattering infrastructure that was never built for such force. This volatility hits the most fragile places, first oasis systems that rely on stable water tables, and transitional zones on the desert's margins, where slight shifts in moisture can decide whether grassland persists or collapses into dust. Oases, once engineered miracles, now face modern versions of an ancient problem: too many demands placed on too little water. In some regions, groundwater pumping expands agriculture and supports growing populations, but the same extraction can lower water tables, salinize soils, and weaken the long-term health of the oasis ecosystem. The three-layer oasis garden date palms above fruit trees beneath crops. Below depends on a delicate balance of shade and moisture. When water drops, the system can unravel from the bottom upward. The result is not only ecological loss, but cultural loss. A way of tourism is another double-edged force. Sahara has always attracted outsiders, explorers, traders, pilgrims, but modern tourism is different in speed and scale. In places that serve as gateways to dunes, such as the well-known dune fields near Merzouga at the edge of Morocco's Erg Chebi, thousands of visitors can arrive in a season chasing the perfect image: sunset on sand silhouettes, on camelback a night under stars. Tourism can bring income, jobs, and global attention. It can fund local services and encourage preservation of certain crafts and traditions. But tourism also reshapes the desert into a stage. Increased traffic can mean more off-road vehicles, cutting tracks into fragile ground, more waste in places where decomposition is slow, and more demand for water and energy in areas where both are costly. In the rush to provide authentic experiences, culture can become a performance traditions, simplified to match visitor expectations, communities pressured to become a product. The Sahara, which taught earlier societies to waste nothing, now faces a modern economy that can generate waste quickly. Plastic bottles, fuel use infrastructure, built for short-term peaks rather than long-term balance. Meanwhile, the desert is increasingly seen as opportunity by national and global planners, especially in energy. The Sahara receives extraordinary sunlight, and the idea of harvesting that light through large-scale solar projects has a seductive logic. In theory, deserts could help power cities and reduce fossil fuel dependence. Yet even clean projects carry trade-offs: land use conflicts, impacts on wildlife corridors, dust and maintenance needs, and questions about who benefits. When development arrives, the desert becomes a negotiation between environmental goals and social justice. Who owns Resource extraction brings its own complexities. Mining oil and gas projects can create economic lifelines, but they also carve roads into remote regions, concentrate wealth unevenly, and increase geopolitical interest in areas that were once neglected. The Sahara's vastness can attract not only investors, but also armed groups, traffickers, and networks that thrive in spaces where governance is weak. In some zones, migration routes pass through the desert, turning the Sahara into a corridor of desperation as well as commerce. The desert's old role as a bridge remains, but the stake Amid all these pressures, contemporary Saharan life is also marked by resilience and reinvention. Cities on the desert's edge and within its broader region continue to grow, serving as hubs of trade, administration, and culture. Marketplaces still echo with the ancient logic of exchange, even if goods arrive by truck instead of caravan. Music traditions adapt electric instruments, blending with older rhythms. Clothing traditions persist, not as costume, but as practical technology fabric that shields from sun and sand colors, that reflect identity patterns, that encode belonging. For communities with nomadic or semi-nomadic roots, modern life often becomes a tension between movement and settlement. School systems, healthcare access, and state services tend to favor fixed addresses. Borders and security policies can restrict migration routes that once followed rain and pasture. Some families maintain mixed strategies, seasonal travel combined with permanent bases. Others settle fully carrying desert knowledge into new forms, guiding transport, work trade, or artisan crafts. The old map stars wells wind. Perhaps the deepest modern challenge is psychological, the world's tendency to view Sahara as nothing. That perception can justify neglect, extraction, or simplification. Yet the desert is not a void. It is a climatic engine, a cultural archive, and a living system with boundaries that shift. Sahara's future will likely be decided by a question that feels both practical and moral. Can modern systems learn the desert's old lesson? Waste nothing, respect limits honor, knowledge, or will the Sahara be treated as an infinite backdrop for other people's needs? Because if the desert has always been a test, then this era may be its hardest. Not because the sun is hotter, though it is. Not because the distances are longer, though they feel longer when people are poorer and bordered. And that brings the story to its final turn. After all this stone and dust, all these roots and pressures, what does Sahara mean now? And what does it demand from anyone who wants to step into its silence? Sahara is often described as the world's great emptiness, but that word never fits for long. The desert is not blank. It is a record of climate swinging like a pendulum of stone, enduring while dunes migrate of life, learning to survive on thin margins, and of human cultures turning distance into knowledge. It holds the memory of wetter ages in rock art and ancient lake beds. It holds the logic of trade routes that once connected worlds through salt, gold, and stories. And it holds a modern warning written in What Sahara asks from the modern world is not pity and not conquest. It asks for humility. It asks people to stop treating arid lands as disposable backdrops places to exploit, tour, or ignore without listening to the systems that keep them alive. In an oasis, every palm leaf and shaded garden layer is a lesson in balance. In a caravan route remembered by stars, every decision is a lesson in preparation. In a desert where waste can kill, restraint becomes a form of intelligence. If travel is part of this story, then the responsibility is simple: travel with respect. Choose operators who protect water and reduce waste. Avoid vehicles that tear fragile ground for the sake of spectacle. Learn the names and histories of the communities who have lived with Sahara for centuries, not as visitors, but as guardians of knowledge. And remember that the most authentic Sahara is not an image, it is a relationship between. On a map, the edge of the world looks like a line. In the Sahara, the edge is a feeling, a horizon that refuses to end, a sky so wide it makes human plans feel small. The question the desert leaves behind is not only what did Sahara become, but also what will we become in a century of limits? Because the Sahara has never been empty. It has always been speaking. The only real mystery is whether the rest of the world will finally learn how to listen.